Today in world literature, we turn to the study of Toni Morrison's Beloved. We focus on ways that we might better understand the novel. I first turn to the larger historical and thematic elements that help place the novel in context. I then examine the world that Morrison has represented in the novel and the role that memory plays in this masterpiece. 124 was spiteful. Toni Morrison's novel Beloved begins. We think, hang life on a number. We think, have life hanged on spite. I want to talk to you about one of the great American novels, Toni Morrison's Beloved. I want to talk about this novel in terms of one of the world's great pieces of literature. Compared to Tolstoy's War and Peace, Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago, William Faulkner's Light in August, Patrick White's Vos, Saul Bellows' Humboldt's Gift, Isaac Bashevis Singer's Sosha, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude, and Love in the Time of the Cholera. In talking about the novel, I want to focus on its background, specifically those aspects of Toni Morrison's career that are important to understanding the novel. I want to focus on the characters, and I wonder if we couldn't recall Tennessee Williams' phrase of a memory play here, and that what we have here is a special novel that calls attention to the importance of the preservation of memory. Specifically, I want to attend to the characters of Sethe and Beloved herself. And I want to talk about some of the ideas examined in this novel. Specifically, I want to talk about representation here of the world of Sethe and Beloved, as the novel opens in 1873 with its flashbacks to 1795, when baby Suggs, a character in the novel, was born, and before that even, to the African roots of the novel. This is a story based on Margaret Garner, a true story of a slave, but as we'll see, Morrison takes imaginative license, appropriately, to try to get at deeper truths of the African-American experience. I also want to talk about the role of memory here. That is, why events that are distant from the present must not be forgotten, but rather we must show these events in full light. Let's begin with the background then, the career of Toni Morrison, who's born Chloe Anthony Woodford and raised by working-class parents in Lorain, Ohio. There's an important sense of place in Morrison's home. It's on the Kentucky border, and it symbolizes the crucial boundary between North and South. There's a history there of the Underground Railroad, of abolitionist activism, and of Ku Klux Klan persecution. Ohio is, in Morrison's phrase, neither plantation nor ghetto, and thus provides her with an ideal site of her analysis of the struggle for freedom. Morrison graduated from Howard in 1953, attended Cornell, received a master's degree there with a thesis on Faulkner and Virginia Woolf, and themes of those writers are certainly present in Beloved. Teaching at Howard University, she married Harold Morrison, an architect, and had 2 children. She moved to Syracuse and then to New York City. She worked as an editor in Random House from 1965 to 1983 and held various lectureships at Yale and at Bard. In 1988, she won the Pulitzer Prize for Beloved, and in 1993, the Nobel Prize for Literature. She is presently at Princeton. The novel Beloved is heavily influenced by slave narratives, as she recalls in an essay, The Site of Memory, published in 1987. Morrison tells us that a very large part of her own literary heritage is the autobiography. And she recalls the importance of slave narratives such as The Quiet Desperation of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, written by herself, 1861, in which Harriet Jacob records a room too small to stand up in, and The Political Savvy of Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, written by himself, 1845. For Morrison, as she says in the essay, memory weighs heavily on what she writes. She quotes Zora Neale Hurston, author of the 1937 classic Their Eyes Were Watching God. Hurston writes, "Like the dead-seeming cold rocks, I have memories within that came out of the material that went to make me." Morrison writes, "These memories within are the subsoil of my work." Note also that in the slave narratives, the writers are interested in dropping a veil over the proceedings too terrible to relate. There's no mention at all in these of an interior life. Morrison believes that it is her job as a 20th century writer to rip that veil, and she does so in Beloved. as well as in her other pieces. Morrison's fiction, The Bluest Eyes, Sula's Song of Solomon, Tar Baby Beloved, and more recently in 1992, Jazz. About preparing to write Beloved, Morrison has written that, I did research about a lot of things in this book in order to narrow it, to make it narrow and deep, but I did not do much research on Margaret Gardner other than the obvious stuff because I wanted to invent her life, which is a way of saying I wanted it to be accessible to anything the characters had to say about it. Recording her life as lived would not interest me and would not make me available to anything that might be pertinent. I got to a point where in asking myself, who could judge Setha adequately, since I couldn't and nobody else who knew her could really, I felt the only person who could judge her would be the daughter she killed. And thus we see early on Morrison's profound interest in epistemology, that is how we come to know things. Morrison is not interested in detail, in historical representation, but she's rather interested in a deeper detail, a deeper finding of the spiritual life of the people that she explores in the novel. Morrison also writes, looking at the scope of American literature, I can't help thinking that the question should never have been, why am I an Afro-American absent from it? It is not a particularly interesting question anyway. The spectacularly interesting question is, what intellectual feats had to be performed by the author or his critic to erase me from a society seething with my presence? And what effect has that performance had on the work? What are the strategies of escape from knowledge, of willful oblivion? Toni Morrison is a writer of unspeakable things unspoken, and clearly that is the frame of reference by which she introduces the characters in this novel. Let's take a look at those. There is, of course, Setha, robbed of her family and nearly her memory by slavery. Carrying the name of the biblical Setha, the child born to replace the murdered Abel, she herself carries the past. She's one of the walking wounded, a survivor. Beloved is the embodiment of Setha's murdered infant and Denver's older sister. She is by turns, though, Setha's grandmother, Setha's ma'am, that is her mother, Setha's murdered child, and Setha herself. Her presence, then, is the presence of a collective memory. Her presence makes this, then, a story of spirits. There is Denver, Setha's daughter. She is like an antelope before birth, an animal her mother has never seen and yet remembers. And it is when Beloved comes into their house that Setha herself begins to remember the past, as well as Denver's birth. Paul D. Gardner, a man through to his compassion and goodness, makes women cry as he comes into their houses. His presence makes this a love story. Baby Suggs, born in 1795, a slave, is Denver's paternal grandmother. Baby Suggs holy, Morrison writes. Hers is a great voice in the novel, and indeed one of the great voices in all of literature. I want to read from you a passage when Baby Suggs takes people into the clearing and perceives then that she might bring them to greater spirituality. And although she is not anointed in any way, her followers come into the clearing and she gives a soliloquy, one of the most moving passages, I think, in all of world literature. She tells her followers, she told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine, that if they could not see it, they could not have it. Here, she said, in this place, we flesh, flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes. They just as soon pick them out. Nor more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder they flay it. The passage goes on to Baby Suggs saying that you should love your own hearts. And in this passage, I think Baby Suggs is representative of a great voice, and that is the voice of the African-American experience in North America, a voice that is timeless, as we'll go into later when we take a look at what this may remind us of in the poetry of Langston Hughes. There is Stampede in the novel. Born Joshua, who had his wife taken for him by a slaveholder and figured his debt to life was paid forever. There is Mr. Gardner, owner of Sweet Home, a name embodying an irony that runs throughout the novel. There is a school teacher, a demon. He's the husband of Mr. Gardner's sister, who assumes the role of plantation master after Gardner's death. It is he who attempts to return Sethe to slavery, and thus is the catalyst for the death of the infant daughter. The baby who Sethe kills, rather than have her return to slavery, and who comes back is the spirit beloved. And there is Edwin Bowden, a Quaker, who supports the Underground Railroad. He nevertheless represents the deep contradiction in his austere removal from the life of the black community. But I also wanted to talk not only about the background and the characters, but the representation in the novel itself. So what is represented here? The representation is embodied in Beloved. It is the representation of the consciousness of a people. It is a representation of relationships. We recall a poem of Langston Hughes, the great poet of the Harlem Renaissance, a poem that is The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Hughes writes, I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. The poem, I think, helps us to better understand the consistent voice that is embodied in Beloved throughout the novel, but as well the voice of Baby Suggs. We have to understand in the chronology of the novel the idea of memory, that the novel itself is layered and not strictly chronologically represented, and that what we have in the collective consciousness is a consciousness that goes back to Africa, that comes through on the Middle Passage, that is embodied in Baby Suggs, in Sethe herself, in the murdered child beloved, and then in the returned child beloved as well. The role of memory, then, is crucial, and it's the part I want to end with in talking about the novel. The importance of remembering the past, the difficulty of doing so. Morrison writes in the very last pages, so they forgot her, beloved, like an unpleasant dream during a troubling sleep. Occasionally, however, the rustle of a skirt hushes when they awake, and the knuckles brushing a cheek in sleep seem to belong to the sleeper. Sometimes the photograph or a close friend or relative, looked at for too long, shifts, and something more familiar than the dear face itself moves there. They can touch it if they like, but don't, because they know things will never be the same if they do. This is not a story to pass on. The passage is significant in that, nevertheless, the story is passed on. The memory, the haziness of a collective consciousness of a people brought to a country in slave ships, the enormous cruelty of the white population is clear throughout the novel. We wonder why the novel is great across time, and we wonder about the importance of remembering the experience of these people. Czeslaw Milosz, Nobel Prize winner, said in his 1980 lecture this of the role of memory, and it's significant. A distance achieved thanks to the mystery of time must not chain events, landscapes, human figures into a tangle of shadows growing paler and paler. On the contrary, it can show them in full light so that every event, every date, becomes expressive and persists as a reminder of human depravity and human greatness. It is explicitly in Toni Morrison's novel her aim to keep landscapes and figures from growing paler and paler, from turning more and more to shadows. So how is it then that we know this is a great novel? I wonder if we might not recall Walter Benjamin's observation in Illuminations when he writes, its essence is not expended in one reading. Indeed, it is the idea that this novel is not to be understood, it seems to me, strictly through analysis, but it is to be understood more on reading and rereading and rereading. It is, after all, then, the idea, as Isaac Bashevis Singer said, that novels or writing has its aim to keep time from vanishing, that Morrison has composed this novel. It is so that things do not grow paler and paler across time. It is for this reason that writers write. In her 1987 review of Beloved in the New York Times Book Review, Margaret Atwood asks us to look closely at the epigraph in the novel from Romans 9:25. It goes, "I will call them my people, and her beloved, which was not beloved." Taken by itself, this might seem to favor doubt about, for instance, the extent to which beloved was really loved, or the extent to which Setha herself was rejected by her own community. But there is more to it than that. The passage is from a chapter in which the Apostle Paul ponders, Job-like, the ways of God towards humanity, in particular the evils and iniquities visible everywhere on earth. Paul goes on to talk about the fact that the Gentiles, hitherto despised and outcast, have now been redefined as acceptable. The passage proclaims not rejection, but reconciliation and hope. It continues, "And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there they shall be called the children of the living God." Here, Atwood continues, is Morrison's final response to the measuring and dividing and excluding school teachers of this world. In Beloved, Morrison shows just how much strength her people have summoned so that they may take their rightful place as the children of the living God.